I think net neutrality is the dumbest stuff ever, right?
The internet is going to run at the speed of government.
This is why it is insane and why we've only seen an influx of censorship and content blockage since these net neutrality rules came into place.
There are two kinds of people. Those who want net neutrality and those who don't know they want net neutrality. This guy wants it, this guy wants it, even this guy wants it, he just doesn't know it yet.
Well, I've continually said that I favor a free and open internet.
Everybody talks about net neutrality, and it seems enough has already been said, so it might look like I am late to the party.
Hey! What the fuck are you doing here?
But I'm making this to say something that hasn't been discussed yet, or not enough at least. Net neutrality is a bureaucratic warfare. I'm going to take you through the history and legality of the net neutrality rules. Because I have no life, I've actually went through the legal documents behind net neutrality, including but not limited to the 1934 Communications Act, the 1996 Telecommunications Act, the Open Internet Order of 2010, Net Neutrality Order of 2015, and the most recent draft order to repeal net neutrality altogether. And I'd wholeheartedly appreciate if you compensated for the lack of my social life by commenting on and sharing this video. Audience engagement doesn't just make the YouTube algorithm wet.
It would make my nether regions engorge.
Okay.
I split my talking points into 6 most evil lies about net neutrality that are used as arguments against it, and I present my counter-evidence to all of them to be used as weapons in the battle for free and open internet. The battle isn't done until Trump signs the bill, so let's not resign yet. We've plenty to cover, so here we go. Net neutrality is overreaching.
The Federal Communications Commission could approve a new set of regulations 332 pages long,
332 pages long,
which will fundamentally transform how the entire World Wide Web operates.
Perhaps the biggest lie that triggered the whole repeal of net neutrality is that the FCC rules are overreaching and that the regulation is just too long and complex. But let's truly see how long the actual net neutrality rules are. So you have this document coming from the FCC in 2015 that they say is when Obama ruined the freedom of internet. That is horrendous, that's 400-page long piece of legislation right there. There's only one problem. This is not 400 pages of net neutrality rules. This is 400 pages of a very long, detailed and in-depth analytical report that the FCC had to make to justify their proposal in front of the Congress. The vast majority of this stuff can be skipped if you are not interested in learning about America's bureaucratic history and their arguments for net neutrality don't matter to you. But if you want to go straight to the rules, you just have to skip to the Appendix A on page 283. This is what got voted on, and this is what got written into the law. This is the very regulatory bit. The rest of this document has probably nothing to do with being a regulation. So let's count together how long this horrendous net neutrality regulation really is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that's it.
332 pages long.
To put it into a perspective, the Communications Act that established the Federal Communications Commission in 1934 and gave this reptile a job is 333 pages long, and the 1996 Telecommunications Act is 128 pages of pure regulation. And to get even bigger picture on this, the actual net neutrality rules don't even span over the full 8 pages. They barely cover more than half a page of text. There are only 4 short legal paragraphs describing the rules of no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization, and no unreasonable interference or disadvantage standard for internet conduct. So the argument that the net neutrality rules are just unnecessary micromanaging over-the-line regulation that needs to be cut off is just a big, big lie. Pai's proposal straight out deletes all of the net neutrality paragraphs, which cuts the regulation by impressive 6 pages.
You went full retard, man. Never go full retard.
Net neutrality isn't necessary.
Here's the thing. This is not even an issue anymore. When it was an issue, Netflix, Verizon and Comcast got together, made a deal, and it was resolved. You know, as something normally happens in what we call the free market.
The commercial internet started off telephone networks, which were tightly regulated and barred from any unreasonable blocking, interference, or preference in content, services, applications, and devices. But when this technology was replaced by high-speed cable broadband and DSL, the 96 Telecommunications Act deregulated these to stir up competition. This gave high-speed broadband providers strong incentives and opportunity to block and throttle competitive traffic. The first to become a victim of such practices were applications like Voice over IP, when Skype began offering telephone calls over the internet for a fraction of the cost of the landline or cell phone calls. Then, big broadband ISPs started to implement termination fees to squeeze more money out of the system by charging websites extra for connecting them to their customers. Some ISPs with broadband commenced to block virtual private networks, which were then popular among firms to connect off-site workers to their company networks. Comcast released a statement that they will block all VPN traffic but offer their customers to use their equivalent at-home Pro for an additional cost of $95 per month. AT&T went full retard when they said this to their DSL customers in the early 2000s. Examples of prohibited programs and equipment include, but are not limited to, mail, FTP, HTTP, file sharing, game, newsgroup, proxy, IRC servers, multi-user interactive forums, and Wi-Fi devices. Customers shall not connect the service or any AT&T broadband equipment to more computers either on or outside of the premises than are reflected in the customer's account with AT&T Broadband. Customer acknowledges that any unauthorized receipt of the service constitutes a theft of service, which is a violation of federal law and can result in both civil and criminal penalties. Throughout 2011, Verizon was blocking Google Wallet, which almost caused the mega behemoth to kill their project. Google was only lucky that T-Mobile and AT&T didn't follow suit, and of course, Verizon did this to prioritize their own mobile payment service, which was then called the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And then there is this whole Netflix vs. Verizon saga. When you subscribe to Verizon Broadband, you technically didn't get access to the internet. You are paying for access to Verizon's network. Verizon, invisibly to you, makes deals with other bandwidth providers and edge providers to exchange the traffic. But because they have such a monopoly on end users, Verizon has the position to blackmail edge providers into higher costs for exchanging the traffic between them and their customers. There's a lot of politics behind the closed doors. When Verizon had a beef with Netflix, it was because Netflix was competing with Verizon's Redbox Instant, and they wanted their customers to have better experience with Redbox rather than Netflix without actually making a better service. In the end, Redbox Instant shut down after 19 months since its release because Verizon did a shitty job at offering a good service and preventing criminal abuse. Literally, criminals used Redbox subscriptions to verify stolen credit cards. So when the ISPs start charging customers for access to entertainment packages, the reality is that it doesn't matter how much you pay Verizon for better broadband speeds. Verizon wants to be a gatekeeper for edge providers to their customers so that they can be the ones controlling the exchange of internet traffic. These deals depend solely on Verizon's business model and anti-competitive network management practices. No amount of your consumer money and begging is going to influence how Verizon treats internet traffic. Which leads me to predict that this whole model of internet subscription packages that we so fear after the repeal of net neutrality won't even be feasible in the long run. That's because ISPs simply won't be able to blackmail edge providers into paying more and ask customers to pay extra to access social media and online video at the same time, while breaking promises made to both, which would make the Federal Trade Commission to step in out of antitrust. They'll either have to choose one, or they'll straight out give you a tightly limited ISP filtered version of the internet, where all you'll be able to access are your ISP products and affiliates. So instead of accessing the internet, we'll all be accessing Verizon, AT&T, Comcast, or T-Mobile intranets.
Welcome to the desert of the real.
Number 3. Net neutrality is unprecedented. It didn't exist before Obama.
But it's a far leap from that kind of light touch regulation that the Clinton administration endorsed in the mid-90s to the heavy-handed regulation, which would put the government in the position of deciding how the entire internet operates.
This is so wrong on way too many levels that it's unbelievable someone would say this with a straight face. The first commercial ISPs in the 90s had a special position as this was the time before broadband came to play. Most people had internet access routed through telephone networks. The FCC made a strong set of rules that were protecting the ISPs from any unreasonable or unjust discrimination by the telecommunications operators. If somebody wanted to become an ISP, they would have to prove they abide by an FCC requirement called maximum separation. This was a principle decided on by the Commission after decades-long proceedings discussing how to regulate the new technology of computer networks. These proceedings were called computer inquiries. The computer inquiries were initiated in the 1960s at the time when the Internet's predecessor ARPANET was going online. The dilemma for the Commission was how and whether to regulate computer networks. The source of authority for the Commission had been the 1934 Communications Act that established the FCC to regulate the telecommunications and information industry and infrastructure in the US. The act wanted to ensure that AT&T wouldn't use its monopoly in telecommunications industry to hijack all other markets which depended on the telecommunications infrastructure. The Act classified services between Title I, which was a light regulation, and Title II, bright line regulation of common carriers. The maximum separation rule prohibited businesses regulated under Title II to enter Title I markets under the same entity. The FCC required that a carrier establish a separate data processing corporation, have separate accounting books, have separate officers, have separate personnel, and have separate equipment and facilities. The Title II clearly specifies that all common carriers are prohibited to make any unjust or unreasonable discrimination in charges, practices, classifications, regulations, facilities, or services, or to make or give any undue or unreasonable preference or advantage to any particular person, class of persons, or locality, or to subject any particular person, class of persons, or locality to any undue or unreasonable prejudice or disadvantage. The FCC was then free to define the specifics of what's reasonable and what isn't, what's a just practice and what's a discrimination. But the most important aspect was defining which providers of what service should be classified as common carriers and follow the Title II regulation. Of course, the regulators of 1930s weren't thinking about the commercial internet invented by the very end of their century. Interpretation was necessary. And this is what started the bureaucratic warfare that had both principles for and against net neutrality developing alongside each other. The FCC wanted all traffic to be treated equally, while at the same time, they wanted to stir up competition and innovation that would boost America's economy. We have to remember that this was set deeply in the Cold War era, when the US's goal was to outcompete the Soviet Union. They couldn't allow their enemy to have any technological advantage over the US. Basing their reasoning on the authority of the Act, the FCC sought for a dichotomy of classifications, to differentiate between services that should be regulated and those that shouldn't. At first, they started looking at this from a technological standpoint. They identified communications processing as a basic service that should be regulated, and data processing as an innovation, an enhanced service that should be left to the competitive market. Basic services were communications networks, and enhanced services were everything more built using the communications infrastructure. But this created odd problems. Technologies are used interchangeably as they develop and innovate until they become indistinguishable. Many basic services were both data and communications processing, and the same went for the enhanced ones. One thing that became clear, though, was that the data processing market was highly competitive, but also completely dependent on the communications market, which was monopolistic. Keeping this dichotomy logic in mind, the Commission realized it had to look at the issues from the standpoint of different markets and not different technologies. The FCC took to focus on different markets and identified 3 layers. The telecommunications market, the ISP market built on top of the telecommunications infrastructure, and the internet content market enabled by the ISP market. The FCC then decided that its position should be to protect competitive markets from anti-competitive practices of monopolistic markets. To protect other markets, the first layer was decided to fall under the Title II regulation because they were monopolistic and had both incentives and opportunities to be anti-competitive. The second layer was vastly deregulated because the FCC saw the potential of thousands of ISPs entering this competitive market. Finally, the third market, which is where Google, Skype, Facebook, or you and I operate, was completely left out of the communications regulations. Finishing computer inquiries in 1986, it is safe to say that without these safeguards, the commercial internet might have never been possible. It would have been immediately hijacked by the monopolies in the communications market like AT&T entirely. The principle that the FCC should regulate monopolies to protect innovation proved to be extremely successful for the 1990s internet. At its peak year of 1998, households in North America had access to over 7,000 independent ISPs. But when high-speed broadband entered the market, things started to change. In 1996, the US government adopted New Telecommunications Act, which took on the same dichotomy the FCC laid out in the computer inquiries. To keep things simple, basic services were classified as telecommunications regulated under Title II, and enhanced services became information services lightly regulated under Title I. Exclusion of broadband from Title II meant maximum separation was no longer a requirement for a monopoly to enter an unregulated market. The Bush administration saw a rampage of ISP mergers and acquisitions. Many American households found themselves in the hands of a single provider in their area. When the courts upheld the FCC's decision to relieve cable and DSL broadband from Title II in the early 2000s, the Commission adopted Internet Policy Statement, where it outlined 4 principles to encourage broadband deployment and preserve and promote the open and interconnected nature of the public Internet. These principles focus on the exclusive choice of consumers and not the ISPs to access the lawful internet content, run applications and services, and connect legal devices that do not harm the network. The 4th rule entitled consumers to competition among network, service, application, and content providers. These principles turned into policy rules when the FCC subjected Verizon and AT&T to honor net neutrality after they merged with MCI and SBC. These rules were strictly codified in the agreements made between the FCC and each of the corporations, but they eventually expired in 2008. Newly appointed FCC chairman Janakowski took this Internet Policy Statement to codify net neutrality in the Open Internet Order in 2010. FCC adopted 3 net neutrality rules: no blocking, no unreasonable discrimination, and the transparency requirement. However, the FCC based its reasoning on the ancillary authority of the Title I regulation of information services. This means that broadband ISPs were still classified under Title I. Title I doesn't specify any concrete regulatory guidelines, but the FCC can take various interpretations of different approvals from Congress to implement its rules until somebody challenges them in court. When the Commission wanted to hold Verizon and Comcast accountable for violating these rules, they were challenged in court and essentially lost, because they were applying Title II regulations to services classified as Title I. The ancillary authority proved to be insufficient. To end these shenanigans that could potentially allow the FCC to regulate everything on the internet under its ancillary authority, Anthony Wheeler decided in 2015 to reclassify ISPs as common carriers under Title II. This gave net neutrality solid legal standing and barred the FCC from overreaching. Under Title II, the FCC cannot use its ancillary authority to regulate markets beyond this classification, which means that edge providers are safe from government regulation, but monopolistic ISPs need to be put in check. the net neutrality rules of 2015 didn't bring anything new to the table, but rather relied on the precedents that the ISPs should be barred from blocking, throttling, paid prioritization, and unreasonable discrimination. The FCC never wanted to regulate technology, but rather protect the markets from monopolies upon which innovation in other markets depended on. So the most logical move for the Commission today would be to reopen the proceedings and consider implementing safeguards to protect the internet market from the ISPs. Because basically the ISP market is controlled by the same people who took over the telecommunications market. Instead, this lizard is moving it into an opposite direction, setting it back into the early Cold War years. His proposal to repeal net neutrality altogether goes against the logic of the FCC to prevent telecom monopolies from controlling the US economy. And by the way, what the fuck is he doing here?
Quality. Are you selfieing or just...
Yo, is this person fucking retarded?
Yes! Number 4. Repealing net neutrality eliminates regulation. No, repealing net neutrality doesn't eliminate regulation. All it's doing is that it changes how the agency defines ISPs. It's a classification warfare. Yes, classification does affect how they approach things, but in legal systems, everything is about the right interpretation of the law. So for example, classifying ISPs under Title II to make them follow the net neutrality rules gives the FCC clear, bright lines on what it can and cannot do. But what's more is that the mere presence of these rules in the Title II doesn't necessarily mean the agency has to apply them at every instance. There is this clause about the public interest in the Section 10 of the Act, which kind of opens the room for more adjusted implementation of the rules. Likewise, classifying ISPs under Title I makes it look like the FCC has to regulate less, but then again, the law is interpreted differently depending on the agenda of those engaged. The Commission can take its ancillary authority that grants its permission to justify certain regulation based on principles set by similar preceding cases approved by the Congress. That's how some net neutrality rules used to be enforced before the reclassification of ISPs as Title II services in 2015. But what's more troubling is that the FCC sometimes relies too heavily on this ancillary authority to the point it can be much more dangerous than in cases under Title II regulations. For example, using broad and open definition in its previous orders, the FCC was given itself enough legroom to pressure ISPs to enforce copyright law in their network management practices, which is of course a dangerous slippery slope because ISPs are best at transferring bits but not at interpreting the copyright laws. As the Electronic Frontiers Foundation warned in 2011, such regulatory practices could make ISPs expediently target traffic that could be regarded carrying infringing content. We know this would be a disaster because the UK has been doing this for a while now and it sucks. Not so long ago, the FCC tried to implement so-called broadcast flags that could have made it impossible for people to make digital recordings, make their own stations with hardware of their own choice, or burn digital content lawfully. This would have given copyright holders immense control over what people could and couldn't own and couldn't do with technology they already own. Thanks to the digital rights advocates fighting this at the court, the judges ruled that the FCC lacked the authority to enforce this regulation, but if nobody challenges the Commission in court, they'll do whatever they want. Pai doesn't eliminate the FCC regulatory overreach. He just positions the regulation where it was found to be ineffective 5 decades ago. Number 5. Free market will take care of net neutrality.
You know, we have something called competition, capitalism. Maybe you've heard of it. If an ISP was suicidal enough to do this, they would be out of business in a hurry.
You're not even a real journalism. That's right.
That's what the regulators thought in the 90s when they forgot to not allow big ISP mergers. This lie is the easiest to dispute. 86% of Americans had access to fixed broadband at top speeds of 25 megabits or greater, but only 37% of them had access to 2 or more providers. Only 3% of the US population could get those speeds on mobile, and all of them had only one choice of provider. 94% of Americans got at least 10 megabits as top speed for fixed broadband, but only 70% of them had at least one more option than Soviet Russia, which is a competition as strong as the possibility of an oligopoly forming between those providers. So the meaningful number is that only 28% of Americans who get at least 10 megabits have access to ISP competition of 3 or more providers. Mobile is doing somewhat better, but only for low speeds of 3 and 10 megabits or more. There is no free market competition of broadband internet providers in America. Most providers enjoy either a monopoly or a duopoly, which in either case sucks for both users and edge providers. Number 6. Net neutrality is a leftist issue. Pai is a Republican, appointed as the chairman of the FCC by Trump. The snake hates net neutrality so much that he took to call it Obama's heavy-handed regulation.
The heavy-handed regulation was Obama-era regulations.
As if Obama invented net neutrality, or as if net neutrality was somehow a leftist issue. Far from it. On February 8, 2004, then FCC chairman Michael Powell, appointed by Republicans, gave his For Internet Freedoms speech, where he listed that users of the internet should have freedom to access lawful content, freedom to use applications, freedom to attach personal devices, and freedom to obtain service plan information. In other words, broadband internet access service providers shouldn't discriminate traffic based on content, applications, or devices, and that they should be transparent about their management practices. Sounds familiar? Following these principles, a North Carolina DSL provider was fined for blocking a voice-over IP program then called Vonage under the Bush administration in 2005. The computer inquiries were initiated under President Johnson and continued all the way to the Reagan's time. They're the ones that set the principle that the FCC should prevent monopolistic markets from harming competitive markets. The architect behind their Internet Policy Statement of 2005 was a Republican appointee and gave founding principles to the net neutrality rules in the Open Internet Order of 2010 under Obama. So no, net neutrality isn't a leftist issue, it isn't a rightist issue, it isn't a party line issue. This principle is so universal and fundamental as fuck! Are the net neutrality rules perfect? Probably not. There can still be some fine-tuning done, but no regulation is perfect, and presence of some debatable practices don't justify dismantling a regulation altogether. In a perfect world, we wouldn't even need the government to regulate ISPs. We'd have
The free market.
I'd always prefer to vote with my wallet than have a government agency somewhere deciding what's right and what's wrong for me. That's my default position when it comes to issues like this. But right now, there is no free market at the ISP level. Big ISP corporations were actively pursuing monopolistic position for over 2 decades now, so they'd get to this point where they could dictate everything to everybody. I see net neutrality as a temporary solution that should be repealed when and only when we develop a coherent strategy to bring back free market into the telecommunications and internet industry. This, however, is not achievable right now, given the limits of the infrastructure. It's hard to bring new providers into developed cities only to dig over infrastructure again. But there could be a possible innovation in the future that would allow more prudent internet access service that could really bring competition back to play. Until that time comes, let's stick together with this net neutrality as our social contract with the ISPs. If you made it here, congratulations, this is the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. Please share this video and engage in discussion by commenting below and liking the video to help it reach bigger audience. Subscribe if you are new to this channel, and see you next time.